Hi everybody and welcome. Let me begin today's proceedings by saying that we are on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce Dr. Carina Wyborn today. Carina has just returned to Australia to take up a new position here at the Fenner School of Environment and Society. And I think in this new role, Carina will be working on her DECRA project, among other things. And the DECRA project is called Foresight in Times of Disruption. So it couldn't be more apt. And we really look forward to having you back home, Carina. Anyway, for today's seminar, we're going to be hearing about Carina's most recent work, which is on the Biodiversity Revisited Initiative. Carina has played a leading role in this initiative. And she did that while she was working for the Luc Hoffmann Institute and living overseas, variously United States, Switzerland. So this initiative began in 2018 and it all began with a really big question. What's wrong with biodiversity? And Carina, of course, has got to explain to us about the origins of this question. But for me, it was really big because the question invites us to think about the ideas and the models, the projects, the programs, the systems that we have built around this concept of biodiversity. And it also invites us to ask, what's going wrong here? Why isn't it working? So it's a very ambitious project. And I was really happy to be involved in a very tiny way in the incubation phase of the project in 2019, when Carina, among others, gathered provocative thought pieces into a big volume, and there are 30 short essays in this volume, which is already an amazing achievement of interdisciplinary work. But the Biodiversity Revisited people didn't stop there, and they went on to craft an agenda for research and action, and that came out in July this year. So it's hard to convey just how much excitement. Thanks a lot. Let's listen up. Over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that welcome. I'd also like to pay my respect to the traditional owners of this land, the Ngunnawal people. Yes, it was a mammoth of an endeavour, and Sarah's actually given it a really great introduction. So I'm going to start where we landed by pressing next slide. Wait, where is the next slide? Okay. Winner. Okay, perfect. Okay. Basic needs. Enjoying coffee and locally sourced breakfast. You cook in a communal kitchen. You watch the news streamed through a vidcast. Luckily, your rations arrived yesterday, so you have fresh coffee for the first time in weeks. After widespread popular revolts in 2021, equality and social welfare are now prioritised by national governments. Many countries turned inwards, focusing on food for their citizens. With less consumption, trade and travel, carbon emissions flatlined. But this morning's news is evidence that this may have been too little too late. Cyclones in the Philippines, catastrophic fires in California in winter, and water shortages across the Andes. You wonder what could have been possible if there were more money available for research and innovation. Not all nature is thriving. Healthy mangroves protect urbanised forests from rising sea levels. Urban food forests are buzzing with visitors, and nature-friendly farming provides food for local markets. However, efforts to protect wildlife are fading as funding has dried up. Iconic species like orangutans and giant pandas are probably extinct, but basic needs are being met and society seems to be adjusting to life within limits. Wildlife rules. You wake up and open a bag of lab-engineered coffee and rip open a box of fortified breakfast cereal from climate-controlled farms. The local desalination plant ensures a constant supply of food despite ongoing droughts in your region. At the annual Global Conservation Summit, a virtual reality tour brings you and your colleagues thousands of miles away to the Congolese rainforest. You see gorillas protected by digital fences and military drones. The project exemplifies the extreme conservation measures adopted globally in 2021 as the world struggled to limit the spread of zoonotic diseases. Though impressed, you wonder where the people lived and how they make their living. As priorities shifted from climate action, emissions growth continued. This means that while militarised conservation protects species locally, Climate-sensitive species are now only found in climate-controlled enclosures in zoos. The Arctic is ice-free in summer and the polar bears are gone. Many people are employed protecting species rather than hunting and harvesting them for food and trade, but society as a whole is disconnected from nature. Climate first. You munch your breakfast of locally farmed oats and an apple from your rooftop garden. As you down your carbon neutral coffee, it's met with a shot of nostalgia for a cup of good Venezuelan coffee. Your Unity BCI plant projects drone footage from the Radical Climate Action Alliance. Deserts covered with solar farms, oceans with wind farms, and farmed land covered with biofuel crops. The Alliance successfully advocated for environmental and human rights treaties to be revoked in 2021 in favour of a climate first charter that prioritises storing carbon and generating clean energy. You feel a sense of pride at a nuclear reactor displaying your national flag and consider how corporations have benefited from green energy partnerships while inequality has risen. The clip closes with images of carbon capturing trees in the Amazon. You'd love to visit one day, but carbon sanctuaries are closed to visitors. Not even Indigenous people who have sustained these landscapes for thousands of years can enjoy them. Widespread restrictions on travel have devastated local economies, and with no ecotourism, funding for conservation is scarce. The Great Barrier Reef has recovered, but wind farms have decimated avian species and bats. So that's a scene. That's three different futures that conservation could be facing, and we had set those scenes in 2020-50. So if that's where we landed, where is it that we began? As Sarah suggested, the project started with the rather ambiguous and ambitious question of what is wrong with biodiversity. Now, while the genesis of this project started in 2017, sorry, when we really hit the stage, it was in the weeks after the first IPBES global assessment had been released. And so, you know, the traditional answer to what is wrong with biodiversity is, well, it's declining badly. But there are a number of different ways in which you can understand that problem. And the way in which you answer the question will depend on where you're located in the world, your disciplinary training, your sector, your area of expertise. For some people, it's about failing global institutions, fragmented policy agendas. For others, it's about science's inability to translate into action. Perhaps it's the wrong type of science. Perhaps it's about better science communication. Other people will tell you that the drivers of biodiversity decline across scale, they're complex, they're systemic, and that our localised conservation efforts are failing to address the real drivers of decline. Other people will tell you that it's a lack of compelling narratives and an inability of the biodiversity community to really convince people of the resonance of biodiversity to their everyday life and to be able to connect their everyday actions to the drivers of biodiversity decline. Yet other people will sort of parrot this idea of climate envy. What's going on? We've been shouting about biodiversity for so much longer, and now climate change has stolen all of the wind. It's the environmental challenge of our day. What about biodiversity? Yet other people will talk to you about the colonial legacy and the sort of embedded white privilege within the conservation community, conservation research, conservation, the global conservation organisations. And from that, other people will talk about the fact that conservation is blind to issues of justice, issues of inequality, and issues of race. So these diversity of answers to this question of what is wrong with biodiversity suggests that we have a very fractured biodiversity community. And part of the idea of this project was to try and bring all of those different ways of understanding and ways of thinking about and answering the question of what's wrong with biodiversity to sort of chart where we might go into the future. So to begin with, one of the first things that we did was kind of condense all of these different answers into this short, provocative proposition statement. So really that statement just summarises a lot of the things that I just said. It's not a compelling object for sufficient action, research and policy are fragmented, there's a lack of a holistic approach. The preponderant focus on describing the biophysical processes of change doesn't provide us with the insights into social and policy dynamics that would facilitate effective action. is the bit that Sarah mentioned, where we gathered commentaries from a range of different experts around the world, and that's all being consolidated into this Seeds of Change volume, which is available and I can share with you if you're at all interested. So the methodology behind the entire initiative, which spanned 2 years and engaged over 300 people from 46 different countries, I think it was in the end, in a process of face-to-face meetings, online dialogues, written inputs and provocations. The idea was to bring these different strands of thought together into this process of recombination, and in hoping that that reflexive process of asking these questions would lead to a renewal of the way in which we conceptualize and act in regards to biodiversity. So the project was underpinned by a set of principles which were iteratively refined over the course of the project. And this presentation of is where we landed. So the project was intentionally pluralist. It wasn't seeking to strive to consensus. In fact, we really sought to hold a diversity of different perspectives open and to hold those different perspectives in debate and tension, understanding that perhaps it was through those differences where we might find the most fertile ground for ideas and collaboration. The initiative was inherently reflexive. It started from this questioning and underlying assumption that what we're doing is fundamentally wrong. And it's not just about reconfiguring the decks on the deck chair, it's, on the sinking Titanic. It's about asking whether or not a ship is really what we need to be sailing to address this massive challenge. In doing so, there was a real effort towards humility and a desire to engage with people who would be humble about this. Biodiversity conservation, I assume many of you would be aware of this, is an arena of very, very heated debates, and has been over the past 10, 15 years, maybe even longer. There's been these very public spats between high-profile conservation officials about what's the right way to do conservation. We really wanted to avoid that. And in doing so, perhaps didn't bring into the fold some of the sort of usual suspects, because we didn't want to get bogged down in rhetoric about whether or not half Earth was a good thing or a bad thing. We just wanted to talk about alternatives and possible ideas. So we had this sort of no egos filter for the people who we wanted to invite into the process. Oh. Keep pressing the wrong button. Did that come up? No. Okay. The process was adaptive. We knew where we were going. We had funding to produce a research agenda, and we knew it was going to be done through expert dialogue. And at every stage of the process, we revisited where we were going and what we were doing and how we were going to implement it. We really had no idea where we were going to land when we started. I mean, a research agenda can take many forms, but the contours of it were unmapped. And that, as I'll talk about later, had both strengths and challenges. It had to be pragmatic. It was 2 years. It was supposed to be global. We really only had a limited amount of money. While we would have loved to have done more on-ground consultation in different parts of the world, it was just not possible. But despite that, we had put in our best effort to try and make it as inclusive as possible. I've worked at the Luc Hoffmann Institute for 5 years, and well, I don't anymore. And I can say that while it wasn't perfect, this was the most diverse of any of the initiatives that the Institute had ever, and I think still to date has ever launched. In that was a commitment to fairness and justice, and an idea that we were going to give voice to perspectives from the margins of the conservation community, and also to create the space to bring in new ideas and people who wouldn't necessarily identify with being part of the conservation community. I keep pressing the wrong button. The idea of the project was to be innovative, to think creatively about what the future for biodiversity could look like, or the various different futures that biodiversity could be, and to again think beyond these sort of constraints of the mind that have shaped conservation research and practice since it began. And there was a need to be accountable both to research and also to practice. We had one donor that was a science-based donor that really just wanted us to produce a research agenda and nothing more. We had another donor for whom just producing a research agenda was not going to be good enough. The project was going to need to actually contribute to making change. And so those two kind of polarities meant that the entire way through the project, we were really driven by this need to do innovative research, but also to connect that to something tangible. Again, wrong button. Okay. So the project had a steering committee of made up of representatives of the partner organisations. So that was the Luc Hoffmann Institute, Future Earth, the University College Cambridge, ETH Zurich, and WWF International. And the steering committee and the dialogues that the steering committee had over the life of the project was one of the arenas in which these ideas were being kind of tussled over. And then, okay, I'm gonna need to put a big red mark on that. We held, the sort of pinnacle event of the project was a symposium in Vienna where we brought together 65 of disciplines, diversity of sectors in one of the most powerful meetings that I've ever been to. Fed and Megan in the room, and I think some people online were there. And it's the only professional meeting that I've ever been in where people sitting in that circle cried openly. I cried, you cried, lots of people cried. It was 3 days of heated, tense engagement with grappling with the challenges that we face, and the fact that people felt comfortable enough to say, like, this is fundamentally a threat to me, my life, my way of being, everything that I care about, and to feel comfortable to be able to express that emotion, I think showed that there was a hunger for this type of reflexive thinking and reflexive engagement. This picture up here is our early career superstars. We ran an early career essay competition to identify early career experts to bring to the meeting. We had, I can't even remember the numbers now, but hundreds of entries into this, and one winner from each continent who came along to the meeting. And that group of people were the drive and the energy behind the time. They're all amazing individuals, and it was a privilege to meet them. And then in January this year, pre-COVID, like literally pre-COVID, that photo was taken in Lombardy as the Italian outbreak was unfolding. I arrived home in Montana to read it on the media after having flown out of Milan. And we were in a little enclosed meeting space and really had absolutely no idea what was unfolding around us. And that was the first of 3 meetings that were held over a space of 2 weeks to sort of close out the initiative. Okay, oh my God. So a little bit more about the process. So the Seeds of Change essays, the early career competition, we had background reviews done on 6 different topics: concepts, narratives, science, governance, systems, and futures. We held a series of expert talks in Boston and where people were asked to provide provocative. We held a series of expert talks in Boston and where people were asked to provide provocative answers to the question of what is wrong with biodiversity. We had thought pieces on a website that were solicited through an open proposal, people just wrote to us and said, I want to write something. And we had a pretty prolific social media campaign led by Nikki Rust, our social media champion. And those inputs went into a series of dialogues that were held over the course of 2 years, starting with consultations in Cambridge, the symposium in Vienna, and then that moved into a series of online dialogues with people who had been participating in the Vienna symposium. And then we had the Bellagio Write Shop, and then we had 2 meetings at the Davos World Biodiversity Forum. Note the northern bias in all of these meetings. I'll get to that. So what we produced was a research and action agenda, commentary in nature sustainability, in which the little stories that I read out earlier were published. a submission to the IPBES Transformative Change Assessment, the scoping workshop for that, and then a thematic issue in environmental conservation, which is just starting to be published now. So that's a lot of ideas. And when we came to January this year, we were like, oh, we've had lots of really, really interesting conversations. Now we need to think about how to bring that all together. And one of the things that we'd found over the life of the project, because of these competing images of what is wrong with biodiversity, we also found that we kept having the same kinds of conversations often. And so we really, in doing the synthesis, needed to come up with some sort of way that we could build on what we had already done and acknowledge the diversity of perspectives and the different opinions of people in the room, but think about how to then move forwards from there. So we used a 3 Horizons framework, a modified 3 Horizons process. So 3 Horizons is a foresighting tool. It's got a little bit behind it, but in its basic notion is a very simplistic idea in that the seeds of the present are with us. The seeds of the future, sorry, are here with us in the present. And in a sort of strategic planning and foresighting kind of an exercise, what one can do is start to uncover these emerging patterns of behaviour and think about where those patterns of behaviour might take us into the future. And then acknowledging that as we move into the future, there's still going to be some seeds of existing patterns of behaviour that will be present, and that perhaps we need some form of disruptive innovation to get us there. So the kinds of changes that might need to take us into this alternative future are probably going to look very different from the future itself. I'm not thinking well enough to give a good analogy at this point in time. Matt, help. Or I can just keep going. Just keep going. Okay, so what we did was we created something like 200 little cards with the ideas from the dialogues, from the written inputs, from all of the different conversations. You all probably can't read any of those, but you know what we see there are things like novel ecosystems, natural capital accounting, Indigenous and community rights, resilient nature, half Earth, biodiversity evaluation. You know, all of these different ideas that you see circulating within the conservation community. And then at the Bellagio workshop, which had 18 people at it, we played around with the different cards and placed them on the different horizons. And it was a really, really interesting exercise, even then at the end of the process, to see just how diverse the perspectives of the people in the room were. So, you know, really, really interesting conversation where between myself and a woman from South Africa, where she was like, wait, you're saying that half Earth is a bad thing? And I was like, how do I go about this diplomatically? Like, wait, you're saying that half Earth is a good thing? And so it was clear that even amongst this community of people who had been on this journey for 2 years, that there was still some fundamental disagreements in the way in which we saw what might be good and bad about the future of biodiversity. So thinking back to the stories that I read out at the beginning, one of the ideas that we really tried to embed in those narratives as we were writing them was that the future has both good things and bad things, and what is good or what is bad is entirely subjective. We found that there were people who really didn't like the futures that we'd written because they wanted there to be a normative good one that we would be heading towards. There were other people who wanted them to be so catastrophic that they would shock people into action. These scenarios need to be so bad. But, you know, the reality is that the future will be mixed, and it will be a sort of composite kind of tug of war between these different heads of the biodiversity world. And we really tried to bring that out when we were writing the scenarios. And so, you know, part of where we landed is this notion that to be thinking more, to be charting biodiversity futures, we need to be embracing imagination and creativity, moving beyond the dominance within the biodiversity community of the biophysical sciences, and not even of the sort of social sciences, academic social sciences, but to start to engage more with creative, arts-based ways of thinking that sort of enable that emotional element of the Vienna meeting that I talked about to really be harnessed, to think about how that can help us to grapple with these ideas of hope and grief and agency. And we need to build anticipatory leadership. We need to be thinking in a more future-oriented way. This is something that conservation really struggles with, given that it has a sort of inherent focus on conserving sites and species assemblages in the way in which they were. I mean, I get critiqued often when I say that, but the reality is that the kind of conservation juggernaut, while there's differences and diversity in there, is really about maintaining things the way they were. And there's a need to accept shared responsibility for moving towards alternative futures, and within that, a need for those who are empowered by the status quo to start to think about letting go of some of their power. Acknowledging trade-offs, that you know, compromise is not something that some aspects of the conservation world like to do, and the reality is that we may not be able to have everything. And we need to be acting without certainty, because the other fundamental kind of feature of our time is the scale and magnitude and complexity of the challenges that we face mean that there will never be complete knowledge. So that's the transformative futures part wrapped up in a little bow. The research agenda, so the goal of the research agenda was to contribute to sustaining diverse and just futures for life on Earth. It has 4 chapters within it. I can go into more detail about those if you're interested in questions, but one was about revisiting biodiversity narratives, and the real clear point about, the sort of main point about that chapter is to suggest that it's not about a new narrative for biodiversity. You know, there's this sort of drive and calls within the conservation community for a new and compelling narrative that will resonate with policymakers and people so that they will care. But actually, if you look back in the history of conservation, there are a plethora of different narratives, and it's actually all about finding a narrative of narratives that enables us to see and embrace this diversity, and you know, borrowing from the humanities and the social sciences to understand the role of narrative as a tool to help us unpack these different ways of seeing and knowing. The Anthropocene, Biodiversity and Culture chapter, one of the main messages within that chapter was really about this need to connect culture to the way in which we talk about biodiversity in the Anthropocene. So the sort of drawing on, again, the humanities and social sciences critiques of the Anthropocene as a concept which creates this amorphous, homogenous humanity that doesn't allow for contextually understood, culturally relevant ways of seeing and knowing, caring about biodiversity that are grounded within place. And that's not just about sort of social science understandings of biodiversity. That's also, we see within biodiversity sciences a growing proliferation of global maps and models and global ways of knowing biodiversity that sort of hide what's going on at that local scale. The Nature and Economy chapter was really focused on trying to understand and think critically about ways in which people have tried to bring together ideas of nature and economy and capital, and sort of thinking on different levels about what's wrong with status quo being sort of mainstream economic practice, what's wrong with conservation's response to status quo mainstream economics. So thinking here about like payments for ecosystem services, how are those processes actually just perpetuating the kind of corporate capital way of seeing and thinking about responses to the nature economy challenge. And then the final section of that was really thinking about, well, what does it mean to be more transformative in the way that we think about the relationship between nature and economy. And then the Enabling Transformative Biodiversity Research and Change chapter is really focused then on, well, how do we tie this all together and think differently about how we engage in biodiversity research and practice, and how we draw on the sort of growing scholarship around transformations and transformative change to help us think not just about transforming those others out there, but transforming ourselves as the conservation community and the way in which we go about doing our research, in the hope that it will be able to connect to all of these other agendas. I need a drink. So, reflections. I never want to do anything this big again is probably I mean, it was enormous. It was enormous. At one of our final meetings, my colleague, who was the person I was the sort of research leading person, and she was the project manager, project lead running the show. And we both had different beasts and worlds and fires going on. And she said, you know, this thing has been as big as pulling together an IPBES assessment in terms of the number of people, the number of meetings, the number of written tasks and engagements. And I was just like, I don't want to know that. I'm never going to get the credit that one would get for like leading an IPBES chapter, an IPBES assessment from this thing. And I don't even, I mean, it's not even about credit. It was just, there was so much passion amongst the group of people who were leading this process. It nearly killed all of us. But part of what kept us going was this amazing appetite for change. I don't think we really were prepared for the number of people for whom this question of what is wrong with biodiversity would resonate. So when I first emailed all of these experts, some of whom I knew, some of whom I didn't, to ask them if they wanted to write essays for the Seeds of Change thing, I mean, I sent out, I don't even know, 40 requests, expecting that most of them would come back and say no. And in the end, we only had 3 people say no. And they said no because they didn't have time, not because they weren't interested. I mean, it was just, there was just the number. Something I just didn't really anticipate. There was a real energy and appetite for empowering early and mid-career professionals and researchers in the process. So there was the steering committee largely left it to myself and Melanie Ryan, my co-conspirator, and then the secretariat to just run the show. I mean, it was an amazing opportunity for us, and we took that on board and used it as a process to elevate people more closer out of their PhDs than us. And the energy and enthusiasm and fresh ideas and different ways of thinking that those group of people brought to the room was really amazing. And also the, you know, to have people from various different parts of the world say things like, this project has completely changed my professional space. You know, I've never been exposed to networks like this before, and I've never had these kinds of opportunities before. And it was a really satisfying and enjoyable part of the process, and was amazing to see the number of people on short-term contracts who were still showing up to contribute to something for which they were never going to get paid. The process, as I said before, was open from the beginning, and that had its strengths and its weaknesses. I think that there were a number of people who sort of came and engaged with us and then couldn't handle the ambiguity, couldn't handle the uncertainty, didn't like not knowing what was going on next and next and next and next. And so it's sort of, there was a bit of a, people who were able to stick with us for the entire journey, I think, felt comfortable with that openness, and we potentially lost other people because they didn't want to be that way. I think one of the lessons for me from that was that a real need to provide more signposts and more of a clear explanation and justification as to why the process was so open. I think we could have done better at providing kind of a cushioning pillow to help people along in their feelings of anxiety about what the hell this thing was and where it was going and what it was going to do. There was a huge value and also a massive amount of tension that came with the diversity of different people that we brought to the room. I mean, arguments, disagreements, frustrations, and I think, you know, had we had a more homogenous group of people, we probably would have been able to go further intellectually than we did. But part of the value of it was the bringing together of all of these different perspectives. And it potentially took us a really long time. I mean, it did take us a really long time to get where we got, because there was just lots of kind of, okay, this is how you see the world. Oh, this is how I see the world, kinds of conversations that took a while, but there was learning through those conversations. There was something else I was going to say there, but I can't remember what it was. Anyway. Oh yeah, that's what I was going to say. There was this really, in the Vienna meeting, one of the pieces of feedback that we had from that meeting was, where were all the conservation scientists? It was a room full of social scientists. I cultivated the invite list. I know who was there. And there was a third of the people had biophysical science training, a third of the people had social science training, and a third of the people had interdisciplinary training. But there was this, the conversation was completely different from the kinds of conversations that you would usually have at a conservation meeting. We weren't talking about ecosystem processes and species assemblages. We were talking about power and justice and inequality and capitalism. And that made people feel like the biodiversity mainstream, or the biodiversity scientists, the real biodiversity scientists, were missing. And that was just a really interesting reflection to me in terms of the ways in which boundaries get set around who gets to call themselves a biodiversity expert and who doesn't. So the structural bias within global conservation, you noted that all of the meetings were in really fancy places in really nice parts of the world. You can also see that the logos of all of the people who were involved in the project were from the north, global north. And I think that was a fundamental misstep from the very beginning, in that when we designed the project, we didn't get partners from many of the esteemed biodiversity institutions in other parts of the world, because it meant that that bias, given the sort of expert-led nature of how we were selecting participants, while we did a good job, we could have done better. It's also just inherently a challenge in that it's much cheaper to fly people to Europe when you're having a global meeting than it is to fly them to other parts of the world. We really, really, really tried, but we did not have the budget to hold the meetings in any other place other than Europe, because it was the cheapest place to get everybody. So, needs to be overcome. I think that there is a real power in grappling with grief as a way to help us find hope and find agency. I think that the process was really empowering, and I think particularly as it sort of was born in a pre-COVID, pre-Black Lives Matter world, to sort of deliver its final products after all of that had happened. And you know, I think the Vienna meeting really nailed on the zeitgeist of 2020, when there was the kind of take-home message from Vienna, and what became the objective of the research agenda was this inability to separate questions of justice and equity from questions of biodiversity. And that, you know, COVID has, and Black Lives Matter and everything that's happened this year has just really shown us that that is even more important than we thought that it was when we met in September in this alternative, what is now feels like an alternative world. So I will stop talking soon. Revisiting how we enable diverse and just futures for life on Earth is going to take many forms. And there are going to be many different ways of thinking about what that future looks like, I think, and many different futures. I think part of the challenges, and one of the things that we really grappled with in this project, is how to create a cohesive whole that embraces and enables the different perspectives to flourish, rather than having them butting against each other and saying, my way of saving nature is best, which is what conservation people really like to do. Justice can no longer be separated from efforts to address biodiversity, climate, sustainability. And I know that that's not a novel thing for people in the conservation social sciences to hear. But what we would argue is that bringing that into the mainstream of the ways in which biodiversity is thought about and conceptualized and acted upon would be transformative, if that was possible. The processes and its outputs, this is, there's a typo, sought to catalyse a broader effort in how we revisit biodiversity. This was just the beginning. We had funding to create a research agenda. We don't have funding to enact it. We intentionally ran the process hoping that we would, you know, bring people along with this in this journey to create energy and enthusiasm to go on to do great things afterwards. whether or not that theory of change holds to bear, I have no idea. People need money to do things. But you know, that recombination and renewal is an ongoing process. And I think that we demonstrated the power of these moments of sort of reflecting as an epistemic community to come together to say, is what we're doing actually working? Actually, really, is it? I think that's a really valuable thing that doesn't get done enough within our academic disciplines. Contemplate the things that we thought about, critique them, adapt them, mold them, take them into their own. And on this final slide is a list of most of the products that have come out of the process, including a special issue that papers are slowly coming out through that. Thanks.
On that note.
So we'll go to questions now. We've got a few online, which we'll just start with, and then we'll go to the room. Andrew McKenzie here. I'm interested in how Carina and the team handled or incorporated Indigenous knowledge.
The never-ending question. I mean, it is really difficult. We had a representative from a Canadian First Nation at our meeting in Canada who works for a Canadian Indigenous. It's a sort of a conglomerate. Fed, Megan, can either of you guys remember mine? It's just completely escaping me right now. Oh my goodness. Okay, it'll come to me. But that's a really tokenistic way of, so we had it was a global meeting. We had one guy from a First Nation in Canada. And one of the things that is a real struggle, I think, with global processes like this is like, how do you bring that type of knowledge in when it's operating at that scale? I think Maria Tango and her crew have done a really great job of thinking about how to bring Indigenous knowledge into something like the IPBES assessment. But I mean, that was an intentional initiative to elevate Indigenous voices into global processes that had a huge amount of resources. That this was one thing that was trying to, I mean, we didn't aspire to be representative. You can't be representative when you're working at a global scale. And so to say that Eli was our channeling our effort to engage Indigenous knowledge is just really, really tokenistic. No one who was invited into the Biodiversity Revisited process, I think with the exception of the partner organisations perhaps, but even still the people on the steering committee, they were all individuals representing themselves. Everybody in the process was invited as a representative of their own perspective. No one was representing their organisation, their community, their institution, because we knew that structures of representation weren't going to work at the scale that we were operating at. So yes, that's kind of what I think we did try to do, is create the space through this global dialogue to say that really matters. And you'll read that in the research agenda that's about trying to find ways to empower and bring together different types of knowledge, different forms of ways of knowing, and that by creating the space for something like that in a global agenda, that was what we were trying to do.
Thank you. So we've got a couple more questions online. So we'll go to Phil first and then to Claudia. So Phil's going to ask via his microphone.
Thanks, Carina. I hope you can hear me. Look, I don't know if you know, but I teach biodiversity conservation at Fenner, and my last lecture, which was in that course, which was recently, which I delivered recently, is about all this stuff. I summarised the IPBES findings on where we need to go, and the global outlook, latest global outlook report, which reviewed the AG targets. And now I'm going to include your papers in the next time I do this. But one thing, that's common is that we need transformative change. But I'm just wondering, is that going to come from within the conservation sector, or do we need to really start to engage more with other sectors of the economy or other parts of government to make this actually happen, given that, you know, we don't have much power? You know, as an example, the Environment Department in Australia has 12 days worth of funding relative to the Defence Department.
Yeah, look, I think that's an excellent question. And John Hutton, the director of the Luc Hoffmann Institute, who has a graph, and I can't remember the figures, looking at the budget of the Climate Convention versus the budget of the CBD. I mean, and that's just within environment sectors, right? So we grappled with this question of transformative change a lot, I think, particularly because the call for the transformative change assessment had come out at the time, you know, during the life of the project, and the scoping workshop happened during the life of the project. For those of you who aren't familiar with IFBES processes, the government's call for particular assessments to be undertaken, and as a product of the global assessment that looked at the status of biodiversity in ecosystems and trends, there was a call for an assessment on transformative change. What does this mean? What does it look like? And so we did a bit of thinking about that, and Phil, I'd be happy to share with you our submission to the assessment, to the scoping workshop. We functioned on the assumption that this meeting was about trying to mobilise transformative change from within the conservation community. Part of the reason why we have, but based on a sort of theory of change, that part of the reason why we fail as a community to engage effectively is because of how we as a community operate. And so we're never going to have traction in those spaces if we don't change ourselves. And so, you know, and I think there's a lot of sort of, is it us that needs to change, or is it them over there that need to change? And we were functioning on the assumption that the starting place was us. Biodiversity as a community, biodiversity as an epistemic community needs to do differently. Otherwise we will continue to fail.
Okay, thank you. So we'll go to Claudia's got a question now. If you want to take yourself off mute, Claudia, as well.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. Thank you, Carina. Very nice presentation. I have a question comment related with that. And I think we are very good at rebranding ideas and concepts around nature, from peace building to sustainable development to nature-based solutions. And I think that working towards diverse, sustainable, and just futures have been the core of many initiatives around the world, even before the Brundtland Report or the Rio Convention. Many countries around the world have created a narrative around nature according to the realities and their aspirations for the future, with this narrative shaping their own ideas and concerns about the environment and how the environment creates nation, for example. So in creating these just and diverse futures, how can we focus on narratives or on ideas that can enable agency and bring hope, as you mentioned it, especially in times where conflicting ideas of nationalism, religious beliefs, and even authoritarianism are influencing the way we make sense of the world? And how can we embrace these diverse and plural narratives and to avoid marginalization of some of the visions and knowledge around these people?
I don't have an answer. I mean, I don't, and I think that that's something that we really struggled with through the project. It was a 2-year process to develop a research agenda, and what you've just outlined is exactly the kind of question that needs to be grappled with. I don't know why I'm speaking to the up there. Hi there. To be asked in tangible ways. You know, we can give these lovely theoretical answers about the value of pluralism and the value of diversity, but I can tell you that actually doing that in practice is incredibly challenging, as we experience through this initiative. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know, other than to say that that's precisely the kind of question that work under this agenda is hoping to kind of get at. And I don't know whether anyone else online or in the room has a better answer to that question than I do, but I mean, I think it's fundamentally a really difficult thing to do without just kind of going into your normative standpoint that like collaboration is good and it's going to save the world. I don't know whether that's the right answer anymore. Megan? No? You have an answer?
No, I don't.
Okay. So here. Yeah.
Thank you, Carina. Carina, there have been numerous attempts to redefine the relationship between research and society and environment. I mean, the monolithic development of human society and economy and politics continues regardless. I'd be happy to agree with all the points you've raised here, but what makes it different from any of the other that have come before? And the second part of my question is, should we just give up our research and join Extinction Rebellion?
So the first part of your question, what makes this different? I think what makes this different is that it was born out of the epicenter of global conservation, as opposed to being something that social scientists were thinking of. Like, this emerged from within high-powered, high-profile people from in the club saying the club needs to change. And that's a different thing from all of the things that I don't know what you do or what your background is, but that you're referring to before, that weren't kind of led by those people. I think that's what makes it different. And that's, you know, and this is something that we've faced in reviews for some of the work, is like, political ecologists have been saying everything that you're saying for forever, or social science. I mean, so yeah, the difference is that it was an initiative of the conservation people trying to change themselves. The second part of your question, should we join Extinction Rebellion? Yeah, look, change comes in many forms, and people are, change comes in many forms and needs to come in many forms. And it's up to the individual and their own aspirations and ways of being in the world to think about whether or not that's the right thing to do. I have issues with the way that Extinction Rebellion operates, but that's a totally different question. And I think this was one of the tensions that was fundamentally at the heart of this entire project. It was being led by a bunch of people for whom we didn't think that more research was going to do anything. But I'm not sure that Extinction Rebellion on its own is going to do everything either. So it gets back to the first part of what I was saying. Change comes in many forms, and it's up to the individual to pursue where they feel that their energies are most fruitful. That wasn't even a complete sentence, but, you know, yeah. Megan?
Thanks, Carina. Thanks, Richard. There was a few things there that touched exactly on the kinds of things that I've been grappling with as one of the review authors. And thank you for generously saying that it's forthcoming. It is, being revised as we speak. Yes, one of the responses is, well, political ecologists or, you know, environmental social science has been talking about this for years. How is what you've written new? That's one of my reviewer comments. The second one is, why don't we all just do Extinction Rebellion, or write papers in high profile journals, or join a committee, all of which, no, seriously, there's one paper that I've cited in my review, which is literally join a committee, in response to a paper saying we should join Extinction Rebellion. This reviewer was saying, well, this author was saying, no, you shouldn't do that, you should join a committee instead. It's all like everyone has their favourite solution that they want to say is the answer, because we kind of, to say that there's multiple pathways or there's multiple ways in which you can engage in change is just not sufficiently comforting, I think, for any of us. It sounds kind of airy-fairy to say, actually, there's a diversity of ways that you can do things depending on your personal interests and values and circumstances, but I can't really find a better answer than that, to be honest, myself. even though it feels very unsatisfying and quite vague to use that in the conclusion of your hard-hitting paper, right? This is just a stream of consciousness, not a question, as you can tell.
The entire project was a stream of consciousness, so it's fine.
In response to another thing that you just said, and I'll just raise another reviewer comment that I've got, because I'm trying to figure these out, you know, so I can get it submitted. One of them was, well, for what mainstream science has written, isn't that biased? If you want to find out what social scientists have been saying about conservation, shouldn't you be looking in journals like, you know, Journal of Environmental Psychology instead of conservation biology? Like, aren't you being a bit biased by critiquing? Like, and I'm just thinking, how do I respond? You know, like, this just kind of neatly encapsulates the issue at hand in terms of who's allowed to call themselves a conservation scientist, who's in the tent.
Yeah.
If you're dabbling in another area, that's fine, as long as you don't, you know, use the words neoliberal or hegemony, you know, too frequently, you know. How do I tie that up into a question? I don't know, but I liked your reflection on the fact that people were saying that, well, you didn't really invite the real scientists to the room because we all ended up talking about justice and you know, humanities issues, even though you did actually invite biophysical scientists. They just weren't the particular usual suspects that we come to expect.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. I yeah, 1000% agree.
I'm trying to figure out how to frame this as a question. And I think I'll frame it by saying, I wonder if political ecologists and social scientists really have been talking about this stuff for years. And if so, where is the evidence in terms of thinking about issues of grief, issues of hope, issues of agency? I don't see it in their work. It's not there. And this gets me to what I think is probably one of the most concerning issues around addressing these concerns, which is that narrative of nature, according to concepts of hope and agency, requires a role for science that is going to be transformatively different. There may not even be a role for science. There may be a role for research, but not research as we know it now. That is devastating to a lot of people. But as you know, I've been involved in the slow food movement equivalent to what you've been doing through the Transformative Adaptation Research Alliance. And the biggest issue that we've grappled with in that has been, what is your role as a researcher in the future? What are the things that you're going to focus on? And how do you actually address that brilliant thing that John Crowley said at the conference in Paris in 2015 around our common future under climate change? How do we exorcise the spectre of technical problematization as an act of transformation?
Yeah, I mean, and I think my answer to that is the same as my answer to, I'm sorry, Richard, thank you. I think that, and this has been, you know, my entire experience in being involved with the Luc Hoffmann Institute. You, Sarah, I remember when I first told you I was working there, said to me, do they know what you do? Do they really know what you do? And, you know, it was the fact that they were employing people like me and doing projects like this that shows you that there is a cohort of people within that global conservation elite who want to do differently. And you know, I'll say things after the recording is stopped. Yes, I never self-censor. I managed to do it. I mean, I think that it gets to, again, your theory of change. You know, do you fight fights with people who don't want to change, or do you work with the willing? And this project was very much about trying to things differently, who wanted to think reflexively and humbly about what it might look like to be different. And you know, to have the chief scientist of WWF globally say that this project has fundamentally changed the way that she thinks about what she does, I think is, you know, was the biggest, like, screw all that. You know, the way in which the people in the steering committee over the life of the project became more and more bought into what it was that we were doing and more engaged was really just showed, again, what I said about there's just this real appetite for people to be thinking and doing differently. And we had lots of conversations in Vienna about, you know, transforming research, transforming the institutional structures that shape relationships between research and practice, and what does it look like to do all of these things in practice. And I mean, again, like, we didn't come up with any answers. We were supposed to be coming up with questions. And so the work now is to go forwards and to ask the questions. Or ask the questions, answer the questions, sorry. I think I need to stop talking.
That's all right. We've got just a couple of comments, so it's okay.
No, that's okay. Keep going.
So from Nimisha, she said, "Thank you, panelists. I'm looking forward to getting involved more in the study of biodiversity and conservation and involved in transformation towards sustainable development." So I think you've inspired a student there. Ian said, the question regarding the question of how to engage with the non-conservation community. In Australia, there are huge opportunities for awareness of biodiversity and ecosystem services in the growing disciplines of regenerative agriculture and government-funded Soils for Life organisation, along with land care movement, which has already engages many farmers, and for more suburban groups such as Garden for Wildlife movement, which aims to change people's backyards and encourage personal change. And Phil also said, thanks for the very thought-provoking seminar about a really big issue. I guess a big problem is with finding the right solution is that nothing has really worked to date.
Yep. Yeah, look, I think regen, ag and all of that world is really an important part of should be part of the way we think about biodiversity. I mean, I think one of the many problem framings that kind of created this community created this initiative was the problems with the silos and the way in which we think about and understand what counts as biodiversity, what counts as conservation, what's ag, what's climate, and by separating it, like it's one place, it's one planet. That's how we need to stop being so fragmented in the way that we think about the earth. That's enough for me.
Okay. Carina's getting exhausted, and I think we're past nominated finish time. Thank you for the most energizing and, yes, provocative hour. This is big stuff. The questions are big. Thank you so much for participating, and thanks so much to Carina. It was fantastic.
Thanks, Sarah.
Signing off here.